The sun was a hammer, and the dust of the Cedar Ridge town square was its anvil. It was a place meant for commerce and community, for Saturday markets and Sunday greetings, but on this scorched Tuesday morning, it had been remade into a stage for a crucifixion. Silas McGrath stood at its center, a man isolated by a sea of faces he had known his entire life. His shirt, a good blue cotton now in tatters, hung from his shoulders like a surrendered flag, revealing a chest mapped with old scars and new bruises. His knuckles were bloodied and swollen, the skin split over bone, the only evidence of the truth the town had unanimously decided to ignore. He did not flinch. He had learned in the war that the best way to endure a barrage was to find a fixed point on the horizon and hold to it. Today, his horizon was the steeple of the First Baptist Church, a stark white finger pointing to a heaven that felt very far away. The air was thick with righteousness, a smell more cloying than the nearby tannery. It was the scent of a mob convinced of its own virtue. "Savage!" a voice shrieked, and Silas's gaze flickered. It was Mrs. Hartwell, the haberdasher's wife, her face, usually a pudding of placid gossip, now pinched and venomous. "Bringing your filthy barroom habits into our town." A glob of spittle struck his cheek. It was warm and foul. Silas didn't wipe it away. He let it track a slow, humiliating path through the grime on his face. He had killed men for less. He had faced down charging lines of bayonets with less tremor in his soul than he felt now, standing before these merchants and mothers, these farmers and blacksmiths. This was a different kind of warfare, one that attacked not the body but the name, the very idea of a man. "He laid hands on that poor girl!" someone else yelled, the accusation spreading like wildfire through dry grass. "Disgraced her!" Silas's eyes, chips of gray flint, involuntarily sought her out. Evangeline Porter stood on the church steps, clutching a shawl around her shoulders despite the oppressive heat. She was a newcomer, had only been in town a few weeks, lodging with the pastor while her father was supposedly away on business. She was young, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with a horror that seemed directed not at him, but at the crowd itself. Her dress was torn at the collar, a detail everyone saw and interpreted in their own salacious way. She was the reason he was here. She was the reason his knuckles were broken. He had found her behind the livery, backed against a water trough by 3 rail drifters, whose intentions were as plain as the rot on their teeth. He hadn't thought. He had acted. The fight was brutal, short, and decisive. He had left the 3 men broken and bleeding in the muck, and had offered his hand to help her up. That was the scene Sheriff Donovan had arrived to find. Silas, the town's brooding, solitary rancher and war veteran, standing over a disheveled young woman with blood on his hands. The rest was a foregone conclusion. The drifters, eager to save their own skins, had spun a tale of a drunken brute assaulting a helpless woman, and they, the noble passers-by, had tried to intervene. Cedar Ridge, a town that prided itself on its propriety, chose the easier story. It was simpler to believe that Silas McGrath, a man they already held at arm's length for the silences and shadows he'd brought back from the war, was the monster. It protected them from the messier truth, that such ugliness could happen in their safe, orderly world, perpetrated by strangers they had failed to notice. Sheriff Donovan, a man whose authority came more from the shine on his badge than any grit in his spine, stood with Mayor Hutchkins on the porch of the general store. They let the venom flow, watching the proceedings with the grim satisfaction of men who saw public order being restored. The mayor, a portly man whose ambitions far outstripped his abilities, cleared his throat. "Silas McGrath," he boomed, his voice attempting a gravitas it could not possess. "This town has no place for men of your violent temperament. You have brought shame upon us." Next to him, Pastor Williams nodded, his hands clasped over his belly. His sermon on Sunday had been about the serpent in the garden, the secret sin that festers in the heart of the community. He looked at Silas now with a sorrowful pity that was more insulting than any curse. "The boy needs prayer," he murmured, just loud enough for those around him to hear and nod in sanctimonious agreement. Then came the stone. It was small, cast by a hand that lacked the strength to make it truly hurt, but its impact was immense. It struck Silas in the chest, a sharp little punctuation to the crowd's hatred. He looked down and saw young Tommy Fletcher, the blacksmith's son, his face a mask of fear and childish cruelty, ducking back behind his father's legs. Silas had once pulled that boy from the river when the spring melt had turned it into a torrent. He had wrapped the shivering child in his own coat and carried him home. The boy's father, who had wrung Silas's hand in gratitude that day, now stared back at him with cold, unforgiving eyes. That was the blow that landed. Not the spittle, not the jeers, not the mayor's pompous decree. It was the stone from a boy he had saved. A chink appeared in his armor of stoicism. A muscle in his jaw clenched, the only outward sign of the bitter acid rising in his throat. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if the world had tilted on its axis, and he was the only one left sliding off. He was a stranger here. After 30 years, after bleeding for the flag they all saluted, after burying his parents in the churchyard behind them, he was an outcast. His gaze returned to Evangeline. Her eyes met his across the square. In them, he saw no condemnation. He saw shame, yes, but it was a shame for the people around her. He saw a flicker of something else, too, a resolve, a hardening of her delicate features that seemed entirely out of place. She held his gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Then she turned, pulling her shawl tighter, and slipped through the heavy oak doors of the church, disappearing into its cool, silent darkness. The closing of the door was a soft, final thud. For Silas, it felt like the closing of a tomb. He was alone, condemned by the very community he had acted to protect, the injustice of it all baking into his soul under the relentless, hammering sun. The saloon was cooler, the air thick with the ghosts of stale beer and cheap whiskey. It was a place for endings, for last drinks and final words. Mayor Hutchkins had convened the official banishment here, away from the raw emotion of the mob, as if moving the verdict indoors gave it the weight of law. Sheriff Donovan stood by the door, his hand resting on his pistol, a theatrical gesture of authority for a man who had never drawn his weapon in anger. Silas stood before the bar, not as a patron, but as a prisoner at the dock. "The council is in agreement, Silas," the mayor said, puffing out his chest. He held a piece of paper, a hastily scribbled writ of exile. "For the sake of public decency and the safety of our citizens, you are hereby banished from the township of Cedar Ridge. You have until sundown to gather your personal effects and be across the county line." Silas looked at the men arrayed before him. The mayor, the sheriff, and a few other sycophantic town council members. He had shared drinks with these men, worked alongside them, trusted them to have his back. Now they looked at him with a mixture of fear and disdain. They were purging him, the uncomfortable reminder of a violence they preferred to pretend didn't exist, except on their terms. "My ranch?" Silas's voice was raspy, low. It was the first time he had spoken since the ordeal began. "The town will take it into receivership," Hutchkins said smoothly, "to compensate for the damages, the disruption you've caused, the medical costs for those poor men you assaulted." The lie was so bald, so audacious, it was almost breathtaking. The ranch was all he had left. It was his father's legacy, bought with sweat and built with calloused hands. To lose it on the word of 3 lying drifters and a cowardly town council was a theft more profound than any stick-up on the trail. A dark, cold rage, the kind he had learned to master in the war, began to uncoil in his gut. He could break the mayor's neck before the sheriff could even clear his holster. He could shatter this whole charade with a few seconds of the very violence they accused him of. His hands curled into fists, the split skin of his knuckles pulling tight. He saw the flicker of panic in their eyes. They knew who he was. They knew what he was capable of. For a moment, the balance of power in the room shifted, teetering on the edge of his control. Then, he let the breath out. Slowly. He let the rage recede. It would do no good. It would only prove them right. His character was being tested not by a bullet, but by a piece of paper. He gave a single sharp nod. "Sundown," he said, the word tasting like ash. He turned and walked out, the sheriff pressing himself against the wall to give him a wide berth. As Silas strode through the dust toward the livery stable to claim his horse, another scene was unfolding in the quiet solitude of the telegraph office. Evangeline Porter pushed the door open, the little bell above it announcing her with a cheerful jingle that was entirely at odds with her demeanor. Samuel Morse, the telegraph operator, a man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetually nervous disposition, looked up from his key. "Miss Porter," he stammered, surprised to see her. We all heard. A terrible business. Truly terrible." Evangeline ignored his platitudes. She walked to the counter, her back ramrod straight, the shawl now discarded. The fear and fragility she had displayed on the church steps were gone, replaced by an aura of formidable command. She was no longer a victim. She was something else entirely. She placed a crisp piece of paper on the counter. "I need this sent immediately," she said, her voice clear and cold, with an edge of authority that made Samuel sit up straight. "The destination is Fort Grant. The recipient is General Augustus Porter." Samuel's eyes widened. He knew the name. Every man, woman, and child in the territory knew the name. General Porter was a legend, a phantom of the frontier, the man who had pacified the Apache territories with a combination of tactical genius and terrifying, relentless force. He was a ghost story told to frighten unruly children and arrogant bandits alike. "General Porter, ma'am?" he squeaked, his fingers hovering over the key as if it were red hot. "He is my father," Evangeline stated, the words dropping into the silent room like stones into a deep well. Samuel's jaw went slack. He stared at the message she had written. It was not the plea of a frightened daughter. It was a military communiqué, concise and brutal. "Cedar Ridge, father, am safe. A good man was unjustly condemned in my defense. His name is Silas McGrath. Town exiled him. I will remain here until you arrive. Your judgment is required, Evangeline." The message was chilling in its efficiency. Your judgment is required. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Samuel looked up at the young woman, seeing her for the first time. The torn dress, the pale face. It wasn't the look of a victim, but of a soldier reporting from a compromised battlefield. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His fingers, now trembling, began to tap out the coded message, the electric clicks echoing in the small office like the ticking of a doomsday clock. Click, clack, click. Cedar Ridge, click, click. Father, click, clack, click. Your judgment is required. Each pulse of electricity shot across the wires, flying over the plains, a harbinger of a storm far greater than any the town had ever known. Evangeline paid Samuel, her movements precise and calm. She walked out onto the porch of the telegraph office and stood, her posture regal, her eyes fixed on the distant eastern horizon. Far across the town, Silas swung himself onto his horse, his saddlebags filled with the few possessions he could carry. He didn't look back at the town. He didn't look back at the ranch he could see nestled in the foothills. He looked forward at the endless, unforgiving expanse of the plains. He was a man with no home, no name, no future. Just the road ahead and the bitter taste of injustice in his mouth. As he urged his horse into a slow walk, heading away from Cedar Ridge, Evangeline remained on the porch, a solitary, watchful figure. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood. And on the far, far horizon, so faint it was almost a mirage, a trick of the heat-hazed light, she saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible disturbance, a plume of dust, rising against the curvature of the earth. It was impossibly distant, yet utterly certain. A slow, secret smile touched Evangeline Porter's lips. The reckoning was on its way. The night passed in a state of suspended animation for Silas. He made a cold camp a few miles beyond the county line, not out of caution, but out of a profound weariness that went deeper than his bones. He didn't build a fire. The darkness was a comfort, a cloak for his wounded pride. He sat with his back against his saddle, staring up at a swath of cold, indifferent stars. He had spent countless nights under this same sky, but tonight it felt alien, hostile. The war had taught him how to survive being hunted by enemies. It had never prepared him for the desolation of being cast out by his own. He thought of the faces in the crowd, the spittle on his cheek, the stone from young Tommy Fletcher. The anger was still there, a hot coal in his belly, but it was banked by a wave of pure exhaustion. What was the point of it all? Of fighting, of surviving, of trying to live with honor in a world that didn't seem to value it? He chewed on a piece of jerky without tasting it, and eventually fell into a shallow, dreamless sleep, the sleep of a man who has lost everything and has nothing left to fear. For Cedar Ridge, the night was one of smug tranquility. A problem had been excised. Order had been restored. Mayor Hutchkins enjoyed an extra glass of brandy, congratulating himself on his decisive leadership. Sheriff Donovan walked his rounds with a newfound swagger, the town now safely rid of its most volatile element. Mrs. Hartwell recounted the day's events to a captive audience at the church social, her voice dripping with righteous satisfaction. They slept the sleep of the just, confident in the walls of their righteousness, never dreaming that those walls were about to be turned to dust. The dawn broke gray and cold, a strange, oppressive pallor in the sky that muted the rising sun. The first sign was not a sight, but a sound. A low, persistent rumble, felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was a vibration that resonated in the floorboards of the houses, that rattled the glass in the windows of the general store. Farmers in their fields paused, placing a hand on the earth, frowning at the strange tremor. Then the sound grew. It separated from the earth and became an audible presence in the air, a deep, guttural drumming that grew steadily in volume and intensity. It was the sound of 1,000 rolling thunderclouds, of an approaching earthquake. People began to emerge from their homes, wiping sleep from their eyes, their faces etched with confusion and a dawning anxiety. They gathered in the streets, looking towards the east, where the sound was coming from. And then they saw it. The dust cloud that Evangeline had seen as a mere wisp the evening before had grown into a monstrous, churning wall of brown and ochre, stretching across the entire expanse of the horizon. It wasn't the playful dust devil of a summer whirlwind. It was the organized, disciplined cloud of a massive, fast-moving force. At its head, the sun glinted off 100 points of metal. The rumble became a roar. The roar became a thunderous, earth-shattering stampede. Out of the dust cloud they emerged, not as a mob, but as a single, terrifying entity. 100 cavalry soldiers, mounted on powerful dark horses, riding in perfect formation. They were clad in the stark blue of the U.S. Army, their faces grim and set, their eyes fixed forward. They moved with the terrifying precision of a well-oiled machine of war, carbines resting in their saddle holsters, sabers glinting at their sides. They were not a posse. They were an army. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge froze. The casual morning greetings died on their lips. The confidence of the previous day evaporated like mist in a furnace. This was a power they did not understand, a force beyond their comprehension. They were ranchers, merchants, and preachers. These were killers. The cavalry swept into the town not with a gallop, but with a controlled, inexorable canter, the drumming of the hooves a deafening funeral march. They didn't stop in the street. They rode directly into the town square, the very ground where Silas had been shamed, and formed a perfect, menacing perimeter, trapping the terrified citizens within their circle of steel and horseflesh. The jingle of spurs and the creak of leather were the only sounds in a world that had suddenly gone silent. Then, from the center of the formation, a man rode forward. He was a Titan, a figure seemingly carved from granite and fury. He sat astride a massive black charger that dwarfed the other horses, its eyes wild and intelligent. The man himself was tall and broad, his uniform immaculate, adorned with the insignia of a general. His face was a mask of cold, controlled rage, framed by a mane of iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. But it was his eyes that held the terror. They were the color of a winter sky, and they swept over the cowering townspeople with an expression of utter, absolute contempt. This was General Augustus Porter. He was not a ghost story. He was real, and he was here. He brought his horse to a halt in the very spot where Silas had stood. The silence was so profound that the flutter of a banner on the hotel porch sounded like a gunshot. Mayor Hutchkins, his face the color of wet dough, pushed his way forward, flanked by a trembling Sheriff Donovan. "General," Hutchkins squeaked, attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace of pain. "This is an unexpected honor. Welcome to Cedar Ridge. To what do we owe the pleasure?" General Porter did not look at him. His gaze was sweeping the crowd, as if searching for someone. He spotted Evangeline, who had emerged onto the porch of the telegraph office. She stood calm and still amidst the panic, and their eyes met. The general gave a barely perceptible nod, a silent confirmation. Then his glacial eyes finally settled on the mayor. "Pleasure has nothing to do with it, Mayor." The general's voice was not loud, but it cut through the air like a razor, each word precise and deadly. "I am not here for pleasantries. I am here for a man named Silas McGrath." The name hung in the air, thick with a new and terrible significance. The crowd stirred, a collective gasp of understanding and dread rippling through them. "McGrath?" the mayor stammered, his jovial politician's mask crumbling completely. The brawler? General, I assure you, he was a menace to this town, a degenerate of low character. For the safety of a young lady, in fact, we were forced to banish him." The general's lips curled into a sneer of such profound disgust that Hutchkins physically recoiled. "You speak of character?" Porter's voice rose, the controlled deadliness giving way to a low, rumbling fury that seemed to shake the very air. "You, a confederacy of cowards and hypocrites, dare to lecture me on the character of a man who fought and bled in battles that would have sent every last one of you pissing your breeches and crying for your mothers?" He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping again to a conspiratorial, terrifying whisper that carried to every corner of the square. "That young lady you so gallantly protected by shaming her rescuer is my daughter." A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over the town square. Faces went from white to ashen. Mrs. Hartwell looked as though she might faint. Pastor Williams's lips moved in a silent, desperate prayer. They had not just condemned a local outcast. They had humiliated the daughter of the most powerful and feared military commander in the Western Territories. They had kicked a hornet's nest, and now the whole swarm had descended. "You pathetic little men," the general continued, his eyes boring into the mayor and the sheriff. "You stood by while your flock of sheep bleated about reputation and decency. You allowed them to spit on a man whose boots you are not worthy to lick. You drove him out, stripped him of his home, and cast him into the wilderness. You did this to the man who saved my child from the very filth you allowed to fester in your town." He paused, letting the weight of his words crush them. "So here are the stakes. They are very simple. Silas McGrath's life, his honor, is worth more to me than this entire pathetic excuse for a town and every soul within it. You have judged him. Now, I will judge you." He straightened up in his saddle, his voice ringing out like a death knell across the square. "You will find him. You will crawl on your hands and knees if you have to. You will bring him back to this square, and you will beg for his forgiveness. You have until sundown. If he is not standing on this spot, safe and sound, by the time the sun touches that western ridge, I will give my men the order to burn Cedar Ridge to the ground. I will salt the earth so that nothing ever grows here again but the memory of your monumental stupidity. Am I understood? No one answered. They couldn't. Their throats were constricted with fear. I said, "Am I understood?" the general roared, the sound echoing off the buildings like a cannon blast. A chorus of terrified, whimpering, "Yes, General," and "Yes, sir," rose from the crowd. "Good," Porter said, his voice returning to its icy calm. He settled back in his saddle, his gaze sweeping over their terrified faces one last time. "The clock is ticking. Run!" For a moment, they remained frozen, paralyzed by the sheer scale of their predicament. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the crowd shattered. Panic erupted. People scrambled, tripping over each other, their minds racing. Find Silas. The words were a mantra of survival. The man they had cast out yesterday was now their only savior. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge, once a unified mob of arrogant judgment, were now a terrified, desperate rabble, racing against the setting sun to undo the terrible injustice they had wrought. Their desperate race against time had begun. The exodus from Cedar Ridge was a chaotic, pathetic spectacle. It was a stampede of pure, self-serving fear. Men who had jeered the loudest now saddled their horses with trembling hands. Women who had whispered the most venomous gossip now urged their husbands to ride faster. The town emptied out in a flood of desperation, a posse not of righteous lawmen, but of condemned sinners seeking their redeemer. Mayor Hutchkins, his face slick with sweat, bellowed contradictory orders. Sheriff Donovan, his badge feeling like a lead weight on his chest, simply tried to point people in the general direction Silas had gone, his own horse skittish and wild-eyed, sensing the panic of its rider. They fanned out from the town like panicked ants from a burning hill, their only guide the vague notion that Silas had headed east into the vast, empty plains. They rode with a singular, frantic energy. The landscape that had seemed so familiar was now alien and menacing. Every ravine could be his hiding place, every copse of trees a potential shelter. They called his name, their voices cracking with a desperate sincerity that had been absent a day before. "Silas! Silas McGrath! Please! Come back!" The words were swallowed by the immense, indifferent silence of the prairie. Hours bled into one another. The sun climbed to its zenith, the same hammer that had beaten down on Silas now beating down on his pursuers. Canteens ran low. Horses began to tire. The initial burst of panic gave way to a grim, grinding despair. They were city folk, merchants and preachers, not trackers. They found no sign of him, no campfire, no tracks their untrained eyes could decipher. The wilderness was vast, and Silas was a man who knew how to disappear within it. Back in Cedar Ridge, the town was an eerie shell of itself. It was populated only by the very old, the very young, and the 100 blue-coated statues who sat on their horses, silent and watchful. General Porter remained in the square, a motionless sentinel of impending doom. He had dismounted and stood by his charger, occasionally accepting a canteen of water from one of his lieutenants, but his eyes never left the western ridge, where the sun had begun its inexorable descent. Evangeline sat on the steps of the general store, a book open in her lap, though she wasn't reading. She was waiting, her calm a stark contrast to the town's hysteria. She had set the gears of this great machine in motion, and now she could only watch them turn. It was young Tommy Fletcher, the boy who had thrown the stone, who found him, not through skill but through sheer dumb luck. Riding with his father, the blacksmith, their horse had thrown a shoe. As his father struggled with the repair, Tommy, frightened and thirsty, had wandered towards a small, rocky creek bed, hoping for a trickle of water. And there he was. Silas was sitting with his back against a sun-warmed boulder, cleaning his pistol with the meticulous, practiced motions of a soldier. He looked up as the boy scrambled down the embankment, his eyes narrowed and wary. He wasn't surprised to be found. He had seen the dust of the disorganized search parties for the last hour. He had simply chosen not to reveal himself. Tommy stopped, his face a mess of dirt sweat, and tears. He looked at the man he had assaulted with a rock, the man who now held the fate of his family, his entire world, in his calloused hands. "Mr. McGrath?" the boy whispered, his voice trembling. Silas finished reassembling the pistol with a final, definitive click. He looked at the boy, his expression unreadable. "What do you want, son?" "You have to come back," Tommy blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. "Please, there's a general and soldiers, and he's gonna burn the whole town down if you're not back by sundown. He said he's gonna kill everyone." The boy's bravado from the day before was gone, replaced by the raw, unvarnished terror of a child. Silas's flinty gaze didn't soften. He had already pieced it together. The massive, disciplined dust cloud he'd seen on the horizon at dawn could only have been one thing: cavalry. And there was only one reason they would be here: Evangeline. He had wondered about the quiet intensity in her, the steel beneath the fragile exterior. Daughter of a general. It made a grim, terrible kind of sense. The blacksmith came running then, followed by the others, drawn by the boys' shouts. They converged on the creek bed, their faces a mixture of relief and trepidation. Mayor Hutchkins practically slid down the dusty slope, his fine suit now ruined. "McGrath! Silas! Thank God!" he gasped, trying to catch his breath. "We found you! You have to come with us! The town is at stake!" Silas slowly rose to his feet. He was taller than most of them, his frame lean and hard. In the wilderness, with a pistol in his hand, the balance of power was starkly different than it had been in the town square. He was no longer the condemned. He was the king of this small, dusty domain. He looked at their faces, the mayor, the sheriff, the blacksmith, all the men who had stood by and watched him be humiliated. He saw their fear. It was ugly and craven, and a part of him, a dark, vengeful part, savored it. "Why should I?" Silas asked, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a boulder. "Yesterday, you cast me out. You called me a savage. You stole my ranch. You let a child throw stones at me. This is your town, your problem." "We were wrong," Sheriff Donovan pleaded, his hat in his hands. It was the first honest thing Silas had heard from him. "We made a mistake. A terrible mistake. Please, Silas. Don't let the whole town pay for our foolishness." Silas looked from face to face, his gaze lingering on the blacksmith, who couldn't meet his eyes. He looked at young Tommy, who was openly weeping now. The rage in him, the desire for retribution, warred with a lifetime of ingrained duty. He had fought to protect people, even people who were not worthy of it. It was who he was. To let them all burn, could he live with that? Could he stand by and watch women and children perish because of the sins of their husbands and fathers? He gave a long, slow sigh. The vengeful part of him receded, leaving behind only a bone-deep weariness. "Get on your horses," he said, his voice flat. "The sun is getting low." The ride back was a surreal inversion of the day before. Silas rode at the front, the townsmen flanking him not as guards, but as a deferential honor guard. They brought him back not as an exile, but as a conquering hero, their last and only hope. As they crested the final ridge overlooking Cedar Ridge, the scene below was stark and dramatic. The sun was a fiery orange ball, kissing the top of the western mountains. Its long, bloody rays painted the town square in apocalyptic light. In the center stood General Porter, his shadow long and ominous. His 100 soldiers sat poised, carbines now resting across their laps, their faces grim. The ultimatum was minutes from expiring. They rode down into the town, the sound of their hooves a frantic echo against the profound silence. The remaining townspeople, who had gathered in fearful knots, rushed forward, their faces filled with a desperate collective hope. Silas dismounted in the center of the square, the dust settling around his boots. He stood on the exact spot where he had been shamed, but now the entire world revolved around him. General Porter walked forward, his spurs jingling with a sound of finality. He stopped before Silas, his cold eyes searching the rancher's face. He saw the bruises, the exhaustion, the quiet, unbreakable dignity. He saw a fellow soldier. He gave a nod of profound respect. "Mr. McGrath," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier fury, now holding only a grave seriousness. "I am in your debt." He then turned to the assembled townspeople, who cowered under his gaze. The posse had returned, dismounting and joining the crowd, their heads bowed. "You have fulfilled the first part of your task. You have brought him back." His voice hardened again. "Now for the second. You will beg his forgiveness." He looked at Silas. "Sir, the fate of this town is in your hands. You have endured an injustice that cries out for vengeance. If you wish me to burn it, you need only say the word. If you wish me to hang its leaders, I will string them up from the rafters of that church myself. The power to pass judgment is yours." Every eye was on Silas. The air was so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. He held the power of life and death, of destruction and mercy in the palm of his hand. He looked out at the sea of faces. He saw Mayor Hutchkins, his jowls trembling. He saw Sheriff Donovan, a man broken. He saw Mrs. Hartwell, her face streaked with tears, her venom washed away by terror. He saw Pastor Williams, praying not for Silas's soul now, but for his own. He saw the blacksmith, his shoulders slumped in shame. And he saw young Tommy Fletcher, hiding behind his father, peering out at him with wide, terrified eyes. The silence stretched, agonizing and absolute. The setting sun cast Silas's shadow long and dark across the faces of his tormentors. He felt the hot, intoxicating lure of vengeance. It would be so easy. One word, burn. It would be just. But then he looked past them, to the church steeple, his fixed point from the morning before. He thought of his parents, buried in that churchyard. They had taught him better. The war had taught him that destruction was easy. Building something was hard. Vengeance would leave him with nothing but ashes, both outside and in. He took a breath, and he began the slow, arduous work of building. "There will be no burning," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm, resonating through the silent square. A collective sigh of relief, so profound it was almost a sob, rippled through the crowd, but the general held up a hand, silencing them. The ordeal was not over. Silas's gaze fell upon Mayor Hutchkins. "Mr. Mayor," he said, his voice devoid of heat, filled only with a chilling disappointment. "You were so concerned with the town's reputation." The mayor stepped forward, his face a mask of desperation. He practically fell to his knees in the dust. "McGrath, Silas, I am a fool, a proud blind fool. What I did, what I allowed to happen, it was a crime. I was wrong. I beg you, forgive me." The apology was raw, stripped of all its usual pomposity, born of utter humiliation. Silas simply nodded, his face unreadable. He looked at Sheriff Donovan. The sheriff didn't need to be prompted. He unpinned the tin star from his chest and held it out, his hand shaking. "I failed my office. I failed the law. And I failed you, Silas. I was a coward. This town deserves better." He dropped the badge into the dust at Silas's feet. One by one they came forward. Mrs. Hartwell, weeping openly, apologized for her vicious words, for letting gossip fester into hatred. Pastor Williams, his face ashen, spoke of a deep failing in his spirit, of mistaking judgment for righteousness, and asked for Silas's pardon as a man and God's as a priest. The blacksmith came forward, his big hands clenched at his sides. "I let my son see the worst of me," he said, his voice thick with shame. "You saved his life once, and I paid you back with scorn. There's no excuse for it." Finally, he pushed his son, Tommy, forward. The boy stood before Silas, trembling, unable to look up from his feet. I threw the stone," he whispered, the confession barely audible. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Silas looked down at the boy. He saw not the face of a tormentor, but the face of a child who had been swept up in something ugly and was now drowning in the consequences. This was the moment. This was the core of his choice. He knelt down, so he was at eye level with the boy. The crowd held its breath. He reached out, not in anger, but with a gentle hand, and placed it on the boy's shoulder. "I know," Silas said, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. "It takes a strong man to admit when he's wrong. You be a strong man, you hear?" Tommy looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning relief. He nodded, tears tracking clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. Silas stood up, his gaze sweeping across the humbled, shamed faces of Cedar Ridge. He had looked into the abyss of his own vengeance and chosen to turn away. He felt the hot coal of anger in his gut finally cool, leaving not emptiness, but a clean, quiet space. He turned to General Porter. "That's enough," he said. "They're broken. There's nothing to be gained from grinding them into the dust." The general studied him for a long moment, then gave a sharp, approving nod. He had seen this kind of strength before, on the battlefield. The strength to show mercy when you have every right to show none. It was the rarest and truest form of command. He turned back to the town. "You have been saved," he boomed. "Not by me, but by the character of the man you condemned. Do not forget that. Do not ever forget the mercy you were shown here today." He walked over to where the sheriff's badge lay in the dirt. He bent down, picked it up, and wiped it clean on his trousers. He strode back to Silas and held it out. "This town needs a new sheriff," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It needs a man of character, a man who understands the difference between law and justice, a man who isn't afraid of a fight, but knows when to show mercy." Silas looked at the star in the general's hand. He had never sought power, only peace, but he saw the faces of the townspeople looking at him, their expressions no longer filled with hate or fear, but with a fragile, desperate hope. He saw a community not destroyed, but shattered, ready to be rebuilt, and he realized, with a startling clarity, that this was where he belonged, not as an outcast, but as a cornerstone. Building a home from the ashes of injustice was harder than riding away. It was a greater challenge. Slowly, he reached out and took the badge. He didn't pin it to his chest, he just held it. It felt heavy, a weight of responsibility, not of power. As the last rays of sun disappeared behind the ridge, General Porter gave a curt order. The cavalry, as one, turned their horses and began to file out of the town, their movements as precise and disciplined as their arrival. The thunder of their departure faded, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. In that quiet, Evangeline walked across the square and stood before Silas. She looked at him, her eyes shining with an emotion that went far beyond gratitude. It was a look of deep, abiding respect and understanding. They had both been tested in this crucible, he by their hate, she by her power, and they had both emerged stronger. "My father offered you vengeance," she said softly. "You gave them grace." "Vengeance is an empty plate," Silas replied, his voice rough. He looked down at the badge in his hand, then back up at her. "I suppose I have a town to look after." "And a life to build," she added, a small smile playing on her lips. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, a partnership being offered. Silas looked around the square, at the humbled people beginning to pick up the pieces of their shattered pride, at the church where his parents were buried, at the saloon where he'd been exiled, at the general store where a new story was beginning. He was no longer Silas McGrath, the outcast. He was Sheriff McGrath, the heart of a community that had been forced to tear itself down to its foundations in order to be rebuilt on something true. He had found his home, not by escaping the pain, but by facing it and choosing to forgive. The peace he felt wasn't easy or light. It was a hard-earned peace, solid and real, built one splinter and scar at a time. And as he stood there, with the weight of the star in his hand and the promise of a shared future in Evangeline's eyes, he knew it was a peace that would last.